The forest pulsed with life beneath the blood-red moon. Shadows stretched long and deep, moving like living things between the twisted trees. A cold wind whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of something dark, something forbidden. Rael smelled her before he saw her, a scent unlike any he had ever known, wild yet delicate, sweet yet laced with death. It seeped into his bones, stirring instincts buried deep within his savage soul. He crouched low behind a thicket, his golden eyes piercing through the darkness. There. She moved with the grace of a specter, barely touching the ground as she glided through the undergrowth. Her silver hair shimmered under the moonlight, flowing like silk over her slender shoulders. Her gown, dark as midnight, clung to her body, shifting like mist around her curves. But it was her eyes that held him captive, amethyst pools, deep and endless, filled with something dangerous. A vampire. Rael's muscles tensed. His kind and hers were sworn enemies, their war older than the stones beneath their feet. He should have torn out her throat the moment he saw her. Yet he didn't move. He couldn't. Something about her held him in place, as if an unseen thread had wrapped itself around his heart, pulling him closer. Celine stopped. She knew she was being watched. Slowly, she turned her head, her lips parting in a whisper of a smile. A deadly smile. She could sense him, feel the raw heat of his presence pressing against her skin like fire. The air thickened between them, crackling with an unseen force. "Come out," she murmured, her voice smooth as velvet. Rael didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, emerging from the darkness like a beast from a nightmare. His massive frame towered over her, muscles rippling beneath his bare chest, scars tracing over his skin like battle-worn stories. His golden eyes burned with a hunger that had nothing to do with flesh. Celine tilted her head, intrigued. She had met wolves before, but none like this one. None who looked at her with such unrelenting intensity, as if she was something meant to be devoured. A flicker of something dangerous passed through her chest. Curiosity. Or was it something more? "You hunt in my territory, vampire," Rael growled, his voice low, edged with a warning. Celine stepped closer, unafraid. The scent of earth and blood clung to him, primal and intoxicating. "Your territory," she echoed, her lips curving. "Do you own the moon as well, wolf?" A deep, rumbling chuckle escaped him, dark and thrilling. "I own what I can take." Her breath caught for just a moment, just enough for him to notice. He moved so fast, she barely had time to react. One moment, he stood before her. The next, he was behind her, his heat pressing against her back. His hand came up, brushing her throat, not an attack, but something far more dangerous. Possession. Celine's pulse quickened, a rare thing for one of her kind. A warning, a thrill. "You shouldn't touch me," she whispered, not pulling away. Rael leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "And yet he let me." Silence stretched between them, thick with something forbidden. Neither of them moved. The world around them faded. The trees, the moon, the war that raged between their bloodlines. In that moment, there was only him, only her, a tension that burned like wildfire, waiting to consume them both. Then, a shift. The air grew heavy, the wind carrying something unseen. A whisper of magic, a warning from fate itself. A pain like fire seared through Rael's chest. He stumbled back, his eyes widening as a burning mark loomed across his skin. Celine gasped, clutching her own arm, where the same mark, an ancient sigil, now glowed beneath her pale skin. Bound. Their gazes locked, filled with the same realization, the same terror. The hunt was over. The curse had begun. Rael's chest burned where the ancient sigil had seared into his flesh. He staggered back, his breathing ragged, golden eyes locked onto the vampire before him. Celine clutched her arm where the same mark glowed beneath her pale skin, her fingers trembling for the first time in centuries. This magic was old, older than their war, older than even the moon itself. A bond. A curse. The wind howled through the trees, thick with the scent of fate itself. Rael's instincts screamed at him to run, to break whatever invisible chain had bound him to the creature before him. And yet he remained, heart pounding like a war drum. Celine lifted her gaze, her amethyst eyes burning with something unreadable. "What have you done?" she whispered. Rael snarled. "Me? This is your doing, leech." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. Neither of them had done this. Something greater, something far beyond their understanding, had woven their fates together in a way that could not be undone. Celine took a step closer, the moonlight caressing her like an unseen lover. Her scent wrapped around him. Dark roses and death, silk and shadows. It made his head swim, his body tense. He hated it. He craved it. She tilted her head, studying him with the quiet intensity of a predator. "The mark," she murmured, lifting her fingers toward his chest. Rael caught her wrist before she could touch him. His grip was iron, his pulse a storm against her cool skin. "Don't," he growled, his voice low, warning. Celine did not flinch. Instead, she smiled, slow and knowing. "Are you afraid, Wolf?" His jaw clenched. No. Liar. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what he wanted. A heartbeat passed, then another. The world around them blurred, lost in the unbearable pull between them. The sigil burned brighter, as if mocking their resistance. Rael inhaled sharply, his grip tightening. "What does it mean?" Celine's smile faded. She knew. He could see it in her eyes. "It means we are bound," she admitted, "by something far stronger than blood. A bond that could not be severed. A fate neither of them had chosen." Rael's growl rumbled through his chest. "Then we break it." Celine arched a delicate brow. "And how do you propose we do that, beast?" He bared his teeth. "I will find a way." She laughed then, a soft, deadly sound. "You think you can fight fate?" She stepped closer, her body a whisper against his own. "What if fate fights back?" His breath hitched, just for a moment, just long enough for her to notice. She could feel it, the war raging within him, the desire he refused to name. And it thrilled her. Celine lifted her free hand, pressing her cool fingers against the sigil on his chest. The second she touched him, a pulse of energy crackled between them, dark and undeniable. Rael's grip on her wrist loosened. Celine leaned in, just enough for her lips to brush against his ear. "You can try to run, Wolf," she whispered, her voice like silk and poison. "But this will chase you." His heart pounded. His body betrayed him. He wanted to tear her apart. He wanted to taste her. He was cursed. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted to be saved. Rael had always known hunger. The raw, primal kind that clawed at his insides, demanding he hunt, take, conquer. But this was different. It was not the hunger of a beast. It was something deeper, something darker. And it had a name. Celine. She stood before him like a vision from a forgotten legend. Silver hair flowing like silk, amethyst eyes burning with secrets. She was moonlight and death, ice and fire, and she was bound to him in ways he could neither explain nor escape. The sigil still burned against his skin, a silent promise of something neither of them understood. Celine took a slow step toward him, her movements effortless, ghostly. The night bent around her, as if it too was at her mercy. She was beautiful in a way that was unnatural, in a way that was meant to be feared. Rael did not fear her. He only wanted. "Tell me, Wolf," she murmured, tilting her head. "How does it feel?" His golden eyes burned into hers. "Like a mistake." Celine laughed, a soft, wicked sound. "Then why do you look at me like that?" Rael tensed. He wanted to deny it, to snarl and bare his teeth, to break something just to remind himself that he was still in control. But he wasn't. Not when she was near. Celine moved closer, her scent wrapping around him. Dark roses, and something deeper, something intoxicating. Her fingers traced lightly over his bare forearm, cold against his burning skin. Rael's breath hitched. Celine smiled. Your heart races, Wolf. He caught her wrist in a crushing grip, his claws threatening to pierce her pale skin. You play a dangerous game. She leaned in, so close that her breath ghosted over his lips. So do you. Rael's pulse roared in his ears. He should have pushed her away. He should have ended this before it began, but his grip on her wrist did not loosen. Instead, his thumb brushed against the delicate curve of her palm, as if testing something forbidden. Celine watched him, her eyes half-lidded, unafraid. Do you hate this? She whispered. Rael's jaw clenched. Yes. No. He exhaled sharply, his free hand gripping the back of her neck, pulling her closer until their bodies were flush. His heat seeped into her, his heartbeat a storm against her stillness. Celine did not pull away. Instead, she lifted her chin, parting her lips in the barest hint of a challenge. Rael growled, low and deep, "You are not mine to want." Celine's lips curled. "And yet you do." He did. Every fiber of his being burned for her. A need that had nothing to do with blood or instinct. It was something deeper, something that defied nature itself. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of something distant, danger, perhaps, or fate tightening its grip. Rael knew this was not meant to be. He knew that wanting her would lead only to ruin. And yet, as he stood there, his fingers tangled in her silver hair, his body caged around hers, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was already lost. Rael ran a hand through his dark hair, his claws barely retracted, his breath still uneven. He needed distance, needed space to think. But the bond burned in his chest like fire, and every step away from Celine felt like a battle against himself. She had done nothing but stand there, watching him with those unearthly violet eyes, and yet she had unraveled him in ways he had never thought possible. Now she sat on a moss-covered stone beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient tree, her silver hair cascading down her back like moonlight spun into silk. The night wrapped around her like a cloak, shadows bending to her will. Rael hated how she looked like she belonged to the darkness. Hated how he wanted to follow her into it. You breathe like a man fighting his own instincts, Celine murmured, her voice smooth, almost amused. Tell me, Wolf, does it hurt? Rael turned, golden eyes flashing. What have you done to me? Celine tilted her head, pretending to think. I wonder the same thing, she admitted, her gaze dropping briefly to the glowing sigil on his chest, the same one that burned beneath her own skin. This bond, it is ancient, unbreakable. Rael clenched his fists. Everything breaks. Celine smiled, slow and knowing. Even you. His jaw tightened. Especially me. She rose in one fluid motion, her movements so effortless they seemed almost inhuman. Then fight it. She stepped closer, her scent, roses and blood, silk and death, seeping into his senses, intoxicating him. Fight me. Rael knew he should. He should put distance between them, silence the hunger roaring through his veins. But his body betrayed him. His breath caught as Celine reached up, her fingers ghosting over the burning sigil on his chest. You are warm, she murmured, almost to herself, like fire beneath my hands. Rael's hand shot up, fingers curling around her wrist. His grip was firm, but not crushing. You are cold, he growled. Celine smiled. Perhaps you should teach me warmth, then. A snarl ripped from his throat. You play a dangerous game, vampire. And yet, you haven't let go. Her words struck deep, deeper than he wanted to admit. His grip on her wrist remained, firm and unyielding, but his thumb moved. Just the barest stroke against her pulse point, a pulse that did not exist. Her eyes burned into his, searching. Do you still hate me, Wolf? Rael didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth was curling inside him like a beast unchained. He had never hated her. not even when he should have. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of rain, of earth, of her. And in that moment, as the night closed in around them, Rael knew that he was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could not be undone. Celine leaned in, her voice a whisper against his lips. "Shall we fall together?" Rael's breath caught. His body tensed. And for the first time in his life, he did not know if he would fight or surrender. Rael's breath was heavy, his pulse an untamed rhythm beneath his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to run, to escape the spell she wove around him like a silken trap. But his feet remained planted, his body betraying him. Celine stood close, too close. Her presence was an intoxicating mix of death and temptation, her violet eyes gleaming like stars swallowed by the abyss. She had no scent, no warmth, yet she was all he could feel. The sigil burned between them, ancient, unforgiving, a bond neither of them had chosen, yet one that refused to be denied. Rael's fingers twitched at his side, aching to grip something. Her wrist, her throat, her waist. Anything to prove that this was real, that she was not some phantom sent to drive him mad. Celine's lips parted, a slow, knowing smile curving at the corners. "You fight so hard," she murmured, "and yet you haven't stepped away." His jaw clenched. "You think this is a game, vampire?" She tilted her head, silver strands cascading over one pale shoulder. "No," she admitted. "I think it's a tragedy." Rael exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move, to put distance between them. His muscles tensed as he turned away. But the moment he did, something inside him snarled in protest. He felt her behind him, still, felt the way the night bent around her presence. "Leave," he commanded, though the word tasted like a lie. Silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Then, "No." Rael froze. The sound of that single word, so soft yet so final, sent a sharp pulse through him. He turned. Celine was watching him, her violet gaze unreadable. "You want me to leave," she mused. "Then make me." Rael moved before he could stop himself. One step, then another. Then his hand was around her throat, his palm against her cold skin, his grip firm, but not cruel. Celine made no effort to pull away. If anything, she leaned into him, her lips parting slightly, her body a breath away from his. "Do it," she whispered, a wicked gleam in her eyes. "Break the bond." Rael's claws extended slightly, his fingers flexing against the fragile column of her throat. He could end this. Right now. One swift motion, and she would crumble like dust beneath his hands. But the thought of her slipping from his grasp sent a sharp, unexpected pain through him. His hand trembled. Celine's eyes softened, just slightly. "You can't, can you?" Rael let out a low, frustrated growl and released her, stepping back as though burned. Celine exhaled, a sound that could have been relief or triumph. "You feel it too," she said quietly. He shook his head. "It doesn't matter." "It does." She pressed, stepping closer again, her voice softer now, more certain. "This bond is stronger than us, stronger than reason." Rael turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "I am not yours." Celine hesitated for only a moment before answering, her voice laced with something dark. "Not yet." Rael squeezed his eyes shut, his claws digging into his palms. The night stretched before them, endless and unforgiving. And somewhere, deep within him, something shifted, something cracked. Because despite every instinct telling him to run, to resist, he knew the truth. He was already hers. Rael prowled through the ruined temple, his breath slow, controlled. Yet the fire inside him raged without mercy. He had left her behind. He had walked away. And still she lingered. Celine. Her name was a curse, an incantation he couldn't unbind himself from. Her violet gaze haunted him, seared into the depths of his mind like a forbidden mark. Her presence clung to his skin, colder than the wind that stirred the dead leaves beneath his feet. She was poison, and he was drinking deep. A whisper of movement. Rael turned sharply, his golden eyes flashing. He wasn't alone, and he already knew who it was. The scent of blood and midnight filled the air before her voice did. "Did you think you could escape me?" She emerged from the shadows like a ghost of the moonlight, her silver hair a flowing river of silk over bare shoulders. The dim glow of torches painted flickering gold against her pale skin, and the ruins bent around her as if they, too, knew she was something untouchable. Rael clenched his jaw. "I didn't run." Celine's lips curved. "No," she agreed. "You never do." A heartbeat passed. Then she moved. Swift as death, she was before him, one cold hand pressing lightly against his chest. Not a threat. A promise. Rael didn't retreat. His pulse pounded against his ribs, his muscles locked in a war he was losing. She was so close. Too close. The faint scent of roses clung to her like an old memory, and her touch was an ache he refused to acknowledge. "I should end this," he murmured, his voice edged with something raw. "Right now." Celine tilted her head, unreadable. "Then why don't you?" His fingers twitched. His claws hovered near her waist, close enough to strike, close enough to pull her closer. She laughed, soft and knowing. "You fear this more than I do." His growl was low, a warning. "I fear nothing." Celine's eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Then prove it." Rael moved without thinking. His hand found the curve of her jaw, rough and burning against her ice-cold skin. He could feel the stillness of her breath, the deadly quiet of her body. Yet she was the most alive thing in this place, in his world. Celine didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a reckless, dangerous surrender. Rael's grip tightened. His chest rose and fell, heavy with something he refused to name. "I hate what you are," he growled. Celine's smile was slow, wicked, and yet his control snapped. In one swift motion, he had her against the stone wall, his body caging hers, the ruins trembling beneath their silent war. She should have been afraid. She should have fought. But she only laughed, low, breathless, triumphant. "Poor wolf," she whispered, her fingers grazing his throat. "You were doomed the moment you saw me." Rael's breath hitched. She was right. Damn her, she was right. Rael had never feared battle. He had never hesitated to bare his fangs and tear through flesh when the moment demanded it. But now, standing before Celine in the dying light of the ruined temple, he felt something far more dangerous than fear. He felt weak. Not in body. No, his strength was undeniable, his muscles coiled with raw, untamed power. But in her presence, he felt unraveled, like a force far greater than himself was pulling him toward the abyss. And she was the abyss. Celine's violet eyes gleamed in the flickering torchlight, her lips curved in a knowing smile. She moved slowly, deliberately, her every step as silent as death itself. Her silver hair cascaded over her shoulders, ghostly in the dim glow, her beauty otherworldly. "Why did you run from me?" she whispered, her voice as soft as a midnight wind. Rael's jaw clenched. "I didn't run." Celine laughed, the sound rich and low, curling around him like an enchantment. "Then why do you fight this?" Her cold fingers traced a slow path along the rough fabric of his tunic, feeling the steel-hard muscle beneath. "You already know the truth." His breathing was heavy, controlled. "I know what you are." Celine tilted her head, studying him. "And I know what you are, Rael." His name on her lips sent something primal crashing through him, a beast that had always been caged. With a growl, he grabbed her wrist, his grip firm, demanding, "Do you think this is a game?" Her expression didn't change. If anything, her smile deepened. "No, my wolf. I think it's fate." Rael hated that word. Fate had never been kind to his kind. But he could feel it too. This pull. This force that neither of them could escape. His golden eyes darkened as he pressed her back against the cold stone of the ruined wall, his breath warm against her chilled skin. "This should not be happening," he rasped. Celine gazed up at him, unafraid, unshaken. "And yet it is." His hands framed her waist, torn between destruction and devotion. Every instinct screamed at him to let go, to turn away. But her scent was in his lungs. Her touch was an unholy fire against his skin. His grip tightened. "I could break you." Celine only smirked. "You won't." Rael's breath was ragged, his body burning from the inside out. She was testing him, daring him to cross the line he had drawn for himself. And he was losing. His fingers brushed against the smooth, ice-cold skin of her throat, feeling the stillness there. No heartbeat, no breath. And yet she was the most alive thing he had ever touched. "I should end this," he murmured, his voice thick with restraint. Celine's eyes searched his, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then do it." Rael didn't move, didn't speak, because they both knew the truth. He could fight 1,000 wars. He could slay monsters, tear through armies, spill oceans of blood. But he could not fight her. His forehead rested against hers, his breath mingling with hers even though she did not need to breathe. Celine's fingers traced the scars on his forearm, her voice a soft confession. "We are bound, Wolf." Rael closed his eyes, his grip tightening around her. "Yes," he admitted, his voice dark and heavy. And then he did the one thing he swore he never would. He surrendered. The night was heavy with silence. The wind whispered through the shattered temple, carrying the scent of ancient stone and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely cry beneath the silver gaze of the moon. Rael stood in the dim glow of the flickering torches, his body tense, his breath slow and controlled. His golden eyes burned as they rested on the woman before him. Celine, his ruin, his salvation. She was still, her violet eyes locked onto his. Shadows danced along her alabaster skin, her silver hair falling like strands of moonlight. She was the embodiment of death itself, beautiful, eternal, untouchable. But he had touched her, and now there was no going back. Rael took a slow step forward, his presence consuming the space between them. The tension was thick, the air charged with something dark, something dangerous. "You shouldn't have let me get this close," he murmured. Celine's lips curled into a knowing smile. "And yet, here you are." He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her cold skin. A shudder ran through him, primal, undeniable. She was ice, and he was fire. A contradiction, a curse. And yet, he could not let her go. Celine tilted her head, her voice soft but sharp. "What are you afraid of, my wolf?" Rael's jaw tightened. He had spent his entire life fighting, bleeding, killing. He had never feared anything. But this was different. "You," he admitted, his voice rough. Celine's smile deepened. Her cold fingers traced the scars along his arm, her touch feather-light. Yet it left a mark deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. "You belong to me now," she whispered. Rael let out a low growl, his hands tightening around her waist, pulling her closer. "No, little vampire. You belong to me." Celine did not resist. She only gazed up at him, unblinking, unafraid. "I was stone," she murmured, her voice a ghost of a sound. "And you brought me back." Rael's fingers slid into her hair, his grip firm but reverent. His heart thundered in his chest. She had been a statue, frozen in time, cursed beyond salvation. And yet, his touch had undone it. His very presence had brought her back to life. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice raw, "but I can't fight it anymore." Celine's fingers pressed against his chest, feeling the wild, steady rhythm of his heart. A heartbeat she would never have. A warmth she could never claim as her own. But him, she could claim him. "You don't have to fight," she whispered. Rael exhaled sharply, his forehead resting against hers. he had fought for so long, but she was the battle he could never win. And perhaps he no longer wanted to. The moonlight bathed them in silver, two creatures who should have been enemies, who should have torn each other apart. Instead, they stood entwined, bound by something deeper than blood, older than fate. A love that should not exist, yet refused to die. Rael's grip on her tightened. If I take you, there's no turning back. Celine's violet eyes glowed in the darkness. Then take me, my wolf, she whispered. And he did.